So hello and welcome to the video. I recently sailed on the MSC Virtuosa from Southampton down to the Canary Islands and back again. And I had a great time. MSC is doing a lot of things right, and most importantly, they seem to be listening to customer feedback and are working hard to make things better and better. But on this cruise, we did have an issue, and it ended up being a significant issue too. It was, though, very easy to see the root cause of this issue, and it wasn't MSC. But MSC could have done a lot more to be proactive about managing the situation. And in the midst of all of this, one MSC employee took a decision which I think is just outrageous. So if you'd like to hear the story, stick around. Hi, I'm Matt, and I love cruising. I love the ships, the places you visit, the entertainment, and every now and again I'll also enjoy a drink. So subscribe and you might pick up some hacks, hints and tips to make your next cruise better. The problems came on disembarkation. Now MSC seems to disembark its passengers based on deck number, so as we'd been relatively low on the ship on deck 9, we'd expected to get off at around 8:20 AM. And around 8 AM we had the first announcement that Border Farce was having some sort of go slow. They were processing people unusually slowly. Now there isn't really a passport check when you get back off the ship into the UK, but there is a customs point, and it seemed that they were making it very, very difficult to get through that check. We waited patiently, and at about 9:20 our group number was summoned forward to head to the gangway, where there already was a very large group of people waiting to get off, so all that happened is that we just joined an existing queue. It turns out that our summons forward had been extremely premature, and we ended up just standing there in a corridor for over half an hour before anything moved. My mum isn't brilliant on her pin, so standing there for half an hour was quite a problem. We had thought about requesting wheelchair assistance, but as it had been such a straightforward process to get off the year prior, we hadn't wanted to bother MSC with a request, which proved to have been a mistake. Now, it's not MSC's fault that Border Farce was being difficult that day, but they could have done a better job of staging people within the ship. They could very easily have left us sitting in that lounge until they knew we would be able to get straight off the ship, rather than calling us forward prematurely. So just before 10 AM, the queue started to move, and you can see that the passageway was rammed with people, including a number of disabled passengers, some with walkers, some in wheelchairs, and others like my mum, who were already really quite fatigued from having to stand for so long. Despite this, some oaf wearing a butler's uniform from the Yacht Club ship within a ship area decided he absolutely had to get his guests off the ship immediately. And that led him to physically barge me out of the way to try and create a space. And as he was pulling his passengers' luggage, he used his luggage to try and lever me out of the way. I had my camera clipped to my chest, so you can't really see it, but I took a number of decent whacks on the legs as he decided he just had to force me out of the way. I did not take this well. If someone tries to physically shove me out of the way, I am inclined to shove back, particularly when I have my elderly mother by my side and I'm trying to protect her from also being manhandled by this thug. Now, priority disembarkation is a perk available to Yacht Club guests, and that's fine. But when it's blindingly obvious that there is no available space to fill, and there's just no room to overtake us regular passengers who are already in the queue to disembark, and when we've all been standing there for well over half an hour growing fatigued and frustrated, and when there are already a number of elderly and disabled passengers already filling this space, I would have thought that common sense would have prevailed, and this thug would have thought better than trying to just shove people out of his way. If it's such a big deal to get these passengers off quickly, MSC could very easily dedicate a separate gangway to them and then open it up to the rest of us normal passengers once the special people are off. But no, we all had to share a gangway, and this thug thought it appropriate to assault people in his attempt to do his job. So we finally got off the ship just after 10 AM, about 100 minutes later than we'd expected. One footnote on the Yacht Club thug: Because of the way the disembarkation security checks worked, I actually got off the ship before that Yacht Club group, even though they had succeeded in barging past me. The group then overtook us on the boarding walkway, which gave me the opportunity to get the thug's name. He refused to give me his name though, and also put his hand over his name badge when I tried to film it. It's completely unacceptable for an employee to refuse to take responsibility and accountability for his actions, and it tells me all I need to know about how he thought he'd behaved. He picked the wrong bloke though as I was filming, so here he is. Now I've obscured his identity here as there are privacy issues from broadcasting it to the world. I will share this video with MSC though, and I will share the unedited footage with them if they ask for it. It was a long zigzag walk down the gangway, but eventually we made it into the baggage hall and realised that our problems had only just started. Your bags are collected from your cabin the night before disembarkation and are numbered corresponding to your disembarkation group. This allows you to walk off the ship unencumbered by your luggage, which you then collect in the baggage hall, leaving you only a short distance to walk with all of your stuff through the customs check, if there is one, and out of the terminal. This is how the process looked last year, but this year, because the customs check was taking so long, there were hundreds of people buffered in a space where buffering was not intended to take place. We were British, so we all valiantly tried to queue in an orderly manner. But as the bags had been distributed around the hall largely randomly, you had to go up and down the hall in order to find the group of bags that included yours. That meant you probably had to cross the queue multiple times to get to and retrieve your bags. And as it was so congested, when you did eventually get hold of your bags, it was a real struggle to find and join the end of the queue. And it turned out there were actually two distinct queues within the space. That meant that some people just decided to push in. It meant that some people looked like they were pushing in, even though they were just trying to cross the queue with their bags. And it meant that some were pushing in, although they didn't realise that that's what they were actually doing because it was such a mess. All of which inflamed tempers, and there were a couple of occasions where we saw people actually squaring up to each other, ready to start swinging. There were no chairs and there was no area where the elderly or disabled could take refuge. It was completely unacceptable to have been put in that position. I could see no MSC staff in that baggage hall, but if I worked for MSC, I would have probably gone and hidden somewhere too. I assume that MSC hands its passengers over to the terminal team once they leave the ship, and so it's the terminal team that I really blame for this. There were plenty of people within the terminal in high-vis jackets just standing around doing nothing. They seemed to be clueless and powerless. The terminal team should never have given approval for more people to be released from the ship into this madness, and MSC should have been all over the situation to have known that even if people were called forward, it was not yet safe to do so. So after about 20 minutes wandering up and down the hall, we eventually found our luggage and were able to make it to the end of one of the queues. And then, fortunately, the Jobsworths from the Border Farce decided that enough was enough. They opened the channel and people started to move much more freely. It had been around 2 hours since the first passenger would have disembarked, so perhaps that was their trigger. They wanted to have a 2-hour protest. Or perhaps they realised they would shortly have casualties on their hands as tempers boiled over. And as we slowly shuffled past the people responsible for all of this, I hope they are really happy with the consequences of their actions. This is how the same space looked last year. There should be repercussions, as these Border Farce people created an unsafe and unstable situation for thousands of people. And then we were out, although as it turned out that wasn't the end of it. Far from it. Unlike most cruise ships which like to get everybody off before they allow people on, MSC overlaps the process. This is usually not a problem, as the peak of the departures is going to be around 9 AM and the peak of the arrivals is likely to not be until 11 or perhaps even 12 o'clock. This was the scene outside when we'd arrived at around 11 AM on the boarding day. Absolutely fine with no congestion at all. Departing passengers had long gone and the volume of arriving passengers was slowly building. On our departure, it was close to 11 AM when we finally made it out, which meant the departures peak coincided with the arrivals peak, and you had close to 9,000 people trying to get through the terminal at the same time. And we were one of the earlier passengers to be called forward. I reckon we were still in the first 20% of people to get off, so there were lots more people behind us. The result was gridlock in the port, and in large parts of Southampton too. It probably didn't help that there were at least 3 large ships turning around in Southampton on a Friday. I didn't film any of this because I thought our travails were over once we were out of the terminal. But as we'd parked in the disabled area, it meant that we had to drive through the drop-off zone to get out of MSC's cruise terminal. It took us 45 minutes to cover the 100-yard distance to the drop-off area in front of the terminal, and another 30 minutes to make it as far as the exit of MSC's terminal. Once again, there were plenty of people standing around in high-vis jackets, but none of them were actually doing anything, and no one seemed empowered to take any action. We finally made it out of the terminal, and it took perhaps another 15 minutes to get out of the port, and it looked very much like large parts of Southampton were gridlocked as well. We ended up just driving away from the port towards Portsmouth to try and clear the gridlock before swinging around the edge of Southampton to make it back to a motorway. We finally made it home over 4 hours later than we'd expected. So who's to blame? Well, that's an easy question. It's Border Farce. It's despicable that public servants that we pay for can take it upon themselves to cause such disruption for the 4,000 or more passengers trying to get off a ship, and that they can do it without consequence. They created a dangerous situation which could have had real consequences for the elderly and disabled passengers caught up in it. If there'd been a medical emergency, it could have been extremely serious, as no emergency vehicle would have been able to make its way through the gridlock. So once again, I don't blame MSC for creating this situation. I do blame them though for not having done more to manage it. They should have been across the situation in the baggage hall and should have known not to dispatch more people into the area, which just made things worse. I suspect MSC was guided by the terminal team, but as I said, they were completely hopeless. But the reality is that all of this was done in MSC's name, and people will draw a very negative conclusion about MSC from having experienced this. Not a happy video today. The cruise that led up to this though was excellent, and I've made a video in which I review that experience, which you can find here. I've tried to be very calm and objective in making this video, but at the time I was really angry because it was an entirely avoidable situation that nobody should find themselves put in. Over to you, MSC.